I will focus on a very small slice in this research, and I hope that you will perceive or hear this as complementary thinking and not adversarial thinking, and as a reference to the affect tension that is an essential part or a key part of the Heiligen-Behe model. Dus do we like it or do we dislike it? So as those who know me are aware, dus I'm working on the use of metaphors and specifically how it connects to the act of making distinctions. And my background is strategic management. I got my PhD from Purdue University. There are some of the people there, the founders of strategic, and it's basically the field where one tries to understand the thinking of a top manager of a large corporation who really needs to think about the consequences of these decisions and action, just all the responsibilities that they carries. And so in that way, it's a field that really demands that one thinks about everything. Just no one can be considered irrelevant because somehow it may be relevant to a particular industry. So it needs to be thought through. And so that is how I really became interested in metaphors. And I kind of came to see that there were like two ways that people were talking about metaphors. This one way is that they trivialize it and they say, yeah, okay, we use metaphors, who cares? We're not going to talk about it because whatever we say, we're like already certain 100% in advance that it's going to be trivial. Versus the other tradition, okay, my slides are going, here, that actually say humans desperately need a lexicon to self-auto-reflect on the consequences of the casual usage of metaphors while they theorize. And the second tradition has been around for 2,500 years, but Aristotle was the first one who pointed out metaphor usage. So a metaphor is a linguistic technology where one says one thing to say something else. And so the metaphor that I will discuss today, actually there's two metaphors that are actually three, and actually once we start counting, there's probably 10. But Michael pointed out the container, content, dus that's one metaphor, an inside and an outside. But the other one is the computational machine that Thomas Hobbes introduced in the 17th century. But so the point that I want to drive home, dus Francis, when I brought up metaphors, dus during your presentation, you said, but my model is more than metaphor. And so, yes, I 100% agree. Your model is capturing much more than the models of Lakoff and Johnson and their students do. Your model focuses on something entirely different. Nevertheless, it will be helpful if you and Shima and everyone else who works on your model really becomes upfront and explicit about the paradigmatic metaphors by which they are working. Specifically, I heard Shima talk over and again about thinking together, knowing together, and I translate that as empathic thinking, empathic listening, empathic knowing. And so if that is really the object or a key driver of this research, so metaphors are helpful just in three ways. So first, they help us communicate with our interlocutors what we're trying to say and what we're not trying to say. So each metaphor comes with some unique set of distinctions. Now, second, paradigms come with specific metaphors. So if you don't like a paradigm, just identify its metaphor and it's much easier to communicate the limitations of a paradigm. And then three, which I think is very important here, that there are two, there's obviously more than two, but I definitely see here an interplay between two different models of the brain. One is the rigid brain and the other is the plastic brain. And the way I see these models is like one set of models sets up the brain as rule governed. There's an automated processing system with different types of layers. And then the plastic brain, that comes from the philosophy of Edmund Husserl in the original, that is a brain that experiments with making distinctions. And here one uses the searchlight theory of consciousness. So it's a brain that's continuously trying out different types of distinctions. And that is a process that starts in the womb with the sentient being coming existent in the womb. So that is a model of consciousness that literally focuses on the womb as a beginning point. And by doing that, it puts the emphasis on sound, because just according to the current understanding, it's like the baby comes in existence on the vibrations of the body of the mother. But let me now go and tell how metaphors can be helpful for a discussion of metaphors can be helpful for Francis and Heiligen. And now I'm going to play an audio clip because Francis said something.
That's the aspect that I don't have time to explain, that I briefly tried to say with those 6 dimensions. Actually, started first for me as another meaning with 6 dimensions. And then I understood that it's a model of meaning, not just in the long term, that's the meaning of my life, but it's also meaning at this moment. What am I experiencing? Is it good? Is it bad? What can I do about it? Where does it come from? What are the next things that may happen? These are all the components of my experience, these implicit predictions, fears, anticipations, desires, they are all there, they are part of your experience.
Okay, so this is what Francis did in this clip. He, he kind of used William James Saddleback metaphor, just by saying experience is always in the present. And so James introduced the saddleback to kind of say, okay, so we're always in the present, and then one modality of our body is engaged in remembering a past, and a different modality is engaged in creatively imagining the future. And it all happens with the help of exosomatic artifacts. And so the sole purpose of this question is this: I'm giving comments to the work of someone else, and I'm just curious to know, Francis and Shima, what metaphor are you using when you talk about time? And actually, you kind of playfully said, Francis, that I have made a real breakthrough in our research which potentially could make us famous. And so I do think you can become famous if you kind of resolve all the different ways that people talk about time. And so you have time as an arrow, then you have time as a purely spatial metaphor. There's a line going from minus infinity through 0 to plus infinity. Then you have the closed system in which time is set up as circular. So your model, you said very clearly, it's anchored in the presence. So how are you then going to make distinctions in a way that you can connect with models who don't say anything about our human relation with the concept of time? So are you going to ignore our human relation with the concept of time, or are you going to actually pay attention to that? And dus Husserl was a person who wrote specifically about how we think as if we can stop the clock and look at the truth of everything, as opposed to thinking in the midst of living. And now this is just a brief intermezzo for all those who think that metaphors don't have a place. A discussion of metaphors do not have place in cybernetics. So we all know about the Macy meetings and what Heinz von Förster did with cybernetics. But there is also another branch in cybernetics that goes through Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, and Mary Catherine Bateson, and then through Klaus Krippendorf and Fred Steyer, who's still with us. And those are all individuals who take a very critical use at how metaphors are being used, and who do not just go along with saying the computational machine metaphor, automated feedback systems, that is the way to think. So this is a way of thinking in which there's a different metaphor is introduced, and I call it the dramaturgical metaphor because that term has been around. And that is dus the plastic brain, where one sets it up as a gestalt switching process. And the dramaturgical metaphor is useful because it makes a distinction between a backdrop, like on the stage, and then a foreground that is the phenomenal experience. So this metaphor actually is actively used in what is known as the object relations brand. Okay, my slides are not moving forward. Okay, object relations brands in psychoanalysis, but let me first just go to a second point I would like to make. So Francis made very clear that he's working with distinctions, and you made a point of saying that you're not presenting a physical field theory, so and that you're actually just have a conceptual model that is an artifact, and that the challenge will be just to develop that bridge. And so if we think of consciousness as a distinction-making process, then we really need to include the human as a designer of those bridges. And now how can we do that? That's by specifically looking at this process of making distinctions completely separate from the rule-governed behavior. And so here I'm just mentioning some of the distinctions that Francis very clearly makes. He never says his model is the reality. He says it's a model and it's not the reality, but they're also the designers of the model, a self in communication with another, and they're really concerned, especially Shima, about an awareness and how we think together as the problem that she's trying to solve. And then there are also the users of the model that are us. Dus we all got the slides and we looked at it and we did something with it. And so this way of thinking of a model, dus that we explicitly look at distinctions instead of rules, that gives us an artifact with which we work. And our discussion on today is really about the consequences of working with that artifact, and especially on unintended, unanticipated, undesirable consequences. And the word unanticipated is important here because that's where the other comes in, the thinking together, because we need an other human being to point out in our own understanding. And so then a model is evaluated dus on the difference, dus the cost-benefit analysis, like how much does the model helps us understand and be together empathically, or how is the model getting in the way of developing an understanding of how empathy works. So what I did is I listened to Shima, and I thought she's clearly working interested in empathic processes, the knowing together, but I may be wrong about that. Now, the other thing, just as Michael pointed out, so there is clearly an interest in those affective forces, but I kind of saw a little bit of a need for extra distinctions, let it say, like to which extent are you interested in these affective forces as automated forces, just like rule-governed, or are you trying to discuss the process, the development over time of an organism that becomes self-aware of how it becomes self-aware? And I use these words to make a reference to things that Shima said, because she really pointed out the awareness of becoming aware. And can we do that if we look at the rule-governed system of consciousness, or do we need to set up consciousness as a distinction making process? And then the fourth issue, and that's my last issue, I call it brain plasticity, because I think it kind of signals where I want to go. These humans come in existence in a womb. So if we're interested in consciousness, then and we try to model it, then we're actually trying to model how that consciousness evolves once that comes into existence. So I'm not interested in the amoeba. I think we first need to understand what happens between a baby and an adult human being that's like 80 years old, and how consciousness evolves over time, and the role of the subjective experience and how that is being modeled. And dus if we think of the baby as coming existence as a sentient being in the womb, then dus the first affective experience that creates tensions is the one of being born. And for those familiar with the object relations branch in psychoanalysis, dus the key experience is solving the riddle of the so-called good and evil breast. So that's clearly an affective tension that the baby experiences when he has to decide how to classify and organize the object parts that it is becoming aware of through his sensory modalities. And the solution to that riddle is the realization that they're not two separate parts, but that they belong to the same body. So that's precisely the sort of thinking that people in systems theory are trying to create awareness about. But what it also does, and that's very important, that is, it makes us aware of how do we think of distinctions. And there are actually three different metaphors. There is one, distinctions as cuts, as cleavage, and that is Bernie Bars. When he sets up a distinction, he makes a reference to Plato's the butcher who knows how to cut nature as his joints. But there is also another way to think of distinctions, and that is as containers. Dus where one uses a container metaphor, and as circles in the sand, where they actually dus don't leave a trace. So no one gets wounded because you hear someone making a distinction. So this emphasis on the plastic gestalt switching brain gives us a very different brain that actually doesn't need or is not interested in the hard problem of consciousness. Because now the hard problem of consciousness, once I have become aware of all these metaphors and how there is this literature that works with it, my eyes have opened to the fact that it was Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century who came up with the idea to say mental operations are identical to those of a mechanical calculator. So there was no hard problem of consciousness until Thomas Hobbes came along and say the two are identical to one another. But there is this another thought experiment that comes from biology that is much more important, I think, and that is the event, and dus we don't know when it happened, but at some point the brain, or whatever you want to call it, consciousness, realized that a sign signifying something else can signify something else from what that brain originally presumed it necessarily signified. So in order to work with the written word, we need a gestalt switching brain. We need a plastic brain. And I do not see our models of consciousness, or many of the models, to really focus on those gestalt switching properties. So I would propose to Francis and Shima to work more on emphasizing the difference between their local field theory and their reference theories, especially if the interest is to understand the thinking together empathically, which I heard Shima say. So that's why I say that if it is about living a more meaningful life, so the hard problem of consciousness originated in the Newtonian paradigm, and it's not telling us anything about empathic processes. Active resonance theory that kind of models the brain as a neural network. This neural networks has nothing to say again about empathic consciousness. The global workspace theory of Bernie Bars, I see him using different metaphors. I got to know his work because he pointed out he's working with a dramaturgical metaphor, but I don't see him clearly making a distinction with container metaphor and computational metaphor. So I see an opportunity for confusion there. And then predictive processes, again, is very Newtonian. because it assumes that a hypothesis creation is a random process. It doesn't say anything about how is the hypothesis created. And if we start with the consciousness as a distinction-making process, then actually it's a consciousness that develops experience with trial and error gestalt switching via disciplined experimentation with schemas of distinctions over time. So it's truly an evolving consciousness, and it's not just a snapshot of a consciousness. And thank you for your attention.